Well, recently I read an article that had some pretty exciting news for the industry. CEOs come and go all the time. And recently, one of the biggest airlines in the world, if not the biggest in the world, announced that his CEO or their CEO was stepping down after a long history. We did a little research, and we found from businessinsider.com an article that does a great job spelling out the history of this airline. This article is written by Taylor Raines. It was last updated on March 28th of 2022. I will put a link in the show notes. And we just wanted to share a little bit about this history with all of you. American Airlines announced in early December that its long-running CEO, Doug Parker, is stepping down after 20 years at the helm. During Parker's 2-decade tenure, he consolidated a number of carriers into American through mergers to create the largest airline in the world. However, his leadership is just one part of the carrier's 95-year history.
American's journey started in 1921 with the founding of Robertson Aircraft, a general flying service and manufacturing company. In 1926, the company operated its first ever flight between St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago, Illinois. The famous Charles Lindbergh was the pilot flying the maiden mail route, ferrying U.S. envelopes and packages between the cities. The flight is considered the first regularly scheduled service of what would become American Airlines. The same year, charter company Colonial Air Transport, formerly known as Beeline, started carrying mail between New York and Boston. The companies were independent, but in 1929, the two merged to create the holding company, Aviation Corporation. This was the first union that would eventually establish American Airlines, which consists of 85 merged companies today.
Aviation Corporation was recognized as an operator and renamed American Airways in 1930, after new laws and reduction of mail routes forced companies to rethink their business models. Finally, in 1934, the company became American Airlines after reworking its routes into a connected system. Cyrus Rolette Smith, better known as C.R. Smith, was named CEO of American later that year. After 8 years of shuttling mail, American began to invest in passenger service. Smith worked with aircraft manufacturer Donald Douglas to develop the DC-3 passenger plane that would change the course of airline history.
The DC-3 was built to carry passengers and make air travel profitable for carriers without relying on government subsidies. The first version was the Douglas Sleeper Transport, also known as Sky Sleepers, which was delivered to American in 1936. The luxurious plane had 14 comfortable seats and 4 compartments that could convert into 7 berths, with 7 additional beds that folded down from the cabin ceiling. The aircraft could carry 28 daytime passengers or 14 overnight passengers. American flew the first DC-3 flight on June 15, 1936, from New York to Chicago. The company was also the launch customer for the standard 21-seater DC-3, which came shortly after the Sky Sleeper.
In the mid-1940s, American took interest in overseas operation. The company acquired American Export Airlines, AEA, in 1945, which already had transatlantic rights to fly across the pond to Northern Europe, a market dominated at the time by Pan Am. The international service started with Voigt-Sikorsky VS-44 flying boats on routes between New York and cities like Shannon, Copenhagen, Berlin, Oslo, and Helsinki.
AEA was renamed American Overseas Airlines in 1945 and launched its first flight from New York to London Heathrow via Boston, Gander, Newfoundland, and Shannon, Ireland, using a DC-4 named Flagship New England. However, unsatisfied with its performance, American sold AOA to Pan Am in 1950 and abandoned its London route, not returning to the city until 1982. In 1953, American pioneered transcontinental travel using the DC-7 between New York and Los Angeles. It was the first airliner to operate the route in both directions.
In addition to the DC-3, American also had a hand in developing the DC-10 trijet. The company wanted a wide-body plane that was smaller than the mammoth Boeing 747, but could still operate long-haul routes to airports with shorter runways. American called on McDonnell Douglas in 1966 to produce the plane and placed an order of 25 of the new jets in 1968. The DC-10 took its maiden flight in 1970 and first entered commercial service with American in 1971 on a round-trip flight between Los Angeles and Chicago.
In the 1970s, American started expanding, growing from a smaller U.S. carrier to a large international player. In January of that year, the airline acquired Trans-Caribbean Airways, gaining routes to places like San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Port-au-Prince, Haiti. In 1981, America West Airlines, which would become part of American's history, commenced operation out of its base in Tempe, Arizona. The carrier was led by Doug Parker and eventually acquired U.S. Airways in 2005, but kept the U.S. Airways brand.
Also, in 1981, American opened its first base at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport after moving its headquarters from New York City to Fort Worth in 1979. American's hub and spoke system grew from Dallas. In 1982, the carrier opened a base at Chicago O'Hare International Airport and returned to London with daily nonstop flights from Dallas to Gatwick. American's regional system, American Eagle, was established in 1984. Today, the airline has 3 wholly owned subsidiaries, including Envoy Air, Piedmont Airlines, and PSA Airlines.
The carrier also designates its regional flying to other contracted carriers, including Republic Airways, Mesa Airlines, and SkyWest Airlines. Towards the end of the 20th century, American continued to expand through route acquisitions and mergers. In 1986, the carrier announced it would buy AirCal, a California-based carrier, for $225 million. This gave American the West Coast routes it needed to expand into a nationwide airline and made it a strong competitor in the lucrative Los Angeles-San Francisco flight corridor.
Shortly after, in 1990, American bought routes to Central and South America from defunct U.S.-based Eastern Airlines. The deal made American a dominant competitor in the region and helped it open its huge hub at Miami International Airport. Continuing eastward, American bought 3 trans-world airline routes to London Heathrow in 1991 for $445 million. This was the first time the carrier flew to Heathrow since the 1940s.
In another merger, in 1999, American purchased Reno Air for $124 million and integrated its network into its operation. However, it sold most of Reno Air's planes and eventually abandoned most of its Reno airport routes. American hit a snag in 1997 when the company's pilots went on strike over low wages. However, the strike was squashed by then President Bill Clinton when he invoked the Railway Labor Act, forcing the crews to settle for lower than demanded pay. Fortunately, the company ended the century on a good note. In 1999, American, along with British Airways, Cathay Pacific Airways, now defunct Canadian Airlines, and Qantas founded the global alliance One World.
Today, One World consists of 14 airlines, though American has recently severed ties with Russia-based alliance member S7 Airlines over the country's invasion of Ukraine. By 2001, American was flying to most corners of the globe, including Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America. It continued to expand that year with the purchase of TWA and its base in St. Louis, Missouri. Through the early 2000s, Americans struggled to recover from financial losses after the 9/11 attacks, which involved two of the carrier's airplanes.
It downsized its St. Louis base, eliminated its more room throughout coach program, and ended 3-class service on international flights. Nevertheless, through its standardization, the company was able to also expand to new cities in Ireland, India, and China. Finally, in 2005, the company posted a quarterly profit for the first time in over 4 years.
However, American hit another roadblock during the financial downturn of 2008. Nearly 1,000 flight attendants were furloughed and 20 MD-80 aircraft were grounded. The company's MD-80 fleet faced scrutiny from the FAA in 2008 and 2009 over wire issues and reported maintenance lapses, like failure to repair cracks in the bulkhead, incorrectly drilled holes, and improper engine coatings. The carrier eventually retired its MD-80s in 2019, replacing them with the newer Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 families.
Meanwhile, all of the company's A300 fleet was retired in 2009 and permanently stored in Roswell, New Mexico. The company continued to make cuts through 2010, effectively closing the St. Louis base and cutting nearly 700 jobs. In 2011, AMR Corporation, American's then parent company, filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The following year, the company started cutting flights due to grounded aircraft and pilot retirements.
While American was working through bankruptcy, union contract negotiations prompted pilots to strike in 2012 over cuts to pay and benefits. As part of the company's restructuring plan, it wanted to merge with another airline and eventually chose U.S. Airways to create the new holding company, American Airlines Group. In 2013, the two completed their union to become the world's largest airline, a title American still maintains today.
The merger kept the American Airlines brand, but placed U.S. Airways CEO Doug Parker at the helm of the combined carrier. The union was met with lawsuits from the Department of Justice and several other airlines who believed the merger would decrease competition and increase airfare. However, all parties settled in November 2013 and allowed the merger to be finalized. The last U.S. Airway branded flight operated on October 16, 2015.
Under the leadership of Parker, American continued to expand. In 2015, it flew its first revenue flight of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner as part of the carrier's fleet renewal plan to improve the customer's experience and its network. From 2018, the company's international network changed as it began experimenting with transatlantic service from its Philadelphia hub. This decreased operations out of the New York JFK Airport, where American operated Boeing 777 aircraft. However, in April of 2021, American ramped up its JFK operation with the announcement of the powerful Northeast Alliance with JetBlue Airways.
American and JetBlue's controversial alliance has worried competitor airlines and the Department of Justice, who say the partnership violates antitrust laws. Nevertheless, the duo has strengthened its presence in the Northeast, strategically scheduling flights and code-sharing on international and domestic routes. Like almost every other global carrier, American faced significant financial losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. The company posted an $8.9 billion loss in 2020, furloughed 19,000 employees, retired over 100 aircraft, and was forced to rely on a government bailout to stay afloat.
While American had to retire dozens of planes, the decision made its fleet the youngest of any U.S. legacy carrier, a silver lining. After trudging through nearly 2 years of COVID-19, the airline announced in December that Doug Parker was retiring. Robert Isom, American's current president, will replace Parker as the new CEO. In an analysis shared with Forbes, Jefferies Financial Group summarized December's announcement as a changing of the reins but no change in strategy. the company suggested American is well positioned to, quote, take advantage of the post-pandemic recovery in travel, end quote. Well, fantastic article.
Very well written.
Hope you all enjoyed it. It really did feel like a history lesson on American Airlines, the world's largest airline. I learned a thing or two, and I hope you did too.
Time ago. I wouldn't know anything about it.
Do you know anything about planes? Do you know anything about planes?
Can you fly this airplane and land it?
No, not a chance. No.